MAGA is having a different cognitive experience of language than the rest of us, and that phenomenon is on full display in this comment. What I mean by a different cognitive experience of language is you and I think of language as something that describes reality. And on Planet MAGA, language is something that shapes and creates reality. The context here is this comment was left on a video I had made describing how Samantha Fulnecke displays the MAGA cognitive experience of language in her essay. Click on the comment to see my original video, but like the short version of the argument is, I see Fulnecke as displaying the MAGA cognitive experience of language in that she doesn't cite a Bible verse, she doesn't talk about any particular theologian, she doesn't discuss Christian views of gender roles throughout the 2,000-year history of Christianity. She just asserts that there are only two genders is a Christian belief, but she doesn't make an argument for why it is. This commenter clearly didn't understand the original video because they are just making the same error that I'm calling Fulnecke out for making. He's just claiming the thing is true without making the argument. Fulnecke says there's only two genders because Bible. This commenter says there's only two genders because Genesis 1:27. My problem is not with Bible. My problem is not with Genesis 1:27. My problem is with the just because, the hand waving. You need to make an actual argument. But of course I would say that because I'm having this cognitive experience of language. For me, a statement is true if it can be supported by good argumentation. But for this commenter, anything is a good argument if it supports a statement that he feels is true. So if I point out all the ways that this is objectively just a weak, poor argument that doesn't stand up under critical scrutiny, if you are having the same cognitive experience of language as me, you will say, this argument must be false. But this guy won't be convinced, right? Because he is having the MAGA cognitive experience of language. All my arguments will be weak because they conflict with his narrative. But I'm going to do it anyway. I'm going to point out a bunch of different ways in which this comment is a weak response to my original video. Do I think any of these arguments will sway this person? No, absolutely not. But that's not the goal of this video. My goal with this video is just to walk you through some arguments that pop into my mind as a way of demonstrating what I mean when I say different experiences of language. So here's 7 ways that this 5-word comment fails to do what it's trying to do. Let's start off with some contextual problems. Number 1, this comment and also Fulnecke's essay was off topic. Fulnecke's original assignment was to read a paper written by a group of psychologists who had done interviews with middle school girls who thought of themselves as tomboys and middle school boys who thought of themselves as a little girly. All the psychologists were interested in is, how does that make you feel to get picked on for being somebody who doesn't fit your typical gender role? There's nothing in the paper about transness, right? But Fulnecke made it about transness. Don't you think that's a little suspicious? Second of all, this commenter says everybody knows that. How does that matter? She wasn't asked to write a Facebook screed. She was asked to write a paper for a class that's going to get graded. Even if this is a well-known citation, you still have to cite it, and you still have to explain how it's relevant to the article. So there's 2 context problems right off the bat. Fulnecke was not asked to write about trans people, but she did. She was asked to write an academic paper, but she didn't. Any sort of quote-unquote defense of what Fulnecke did needs to have a response to these kinds of contextual criticisms. Otherwise, you're not really defending her actions, you're just rationalizing her behavior. So let's move on to the textual problem. Genesis chapter 1 is where we're rattling through a list of all the things that God creates when he's creating the universe. And when we get to verse 27, God is creating male and female, men and women. Where in this verse does it say that a person cannot move in between the two? Where in this passage does it say that God is unable to move a person in between the two? That's textual problem number 1. Second textual problem, why are you reading Genesis 1:27 as a binary and not a spectrum? Genesis 1:9 says God created the seas and the earth. So are you telling me that swamps and marshes go against God? Genesis 29 says God created the seed-bearing plants and the trees. So are mushrooms the work of the devil in your theology? Text problem number 3, what are you doing about the eunuchs? In the ancient Near East cultures that gave us the Bible, they had roles and jobs for women, they had roles and jobs for men, and they had roles and jobs that needed to be done that they didn't think were suitable for either gender. So they created this third gender called eunuchs. The Bible is full of eunuchs. Eunuchs were people who started their lives off as men, but then had an elective surgery to their genitalia that through the social constructs of the time then permitted them to traverse the spaces between man and woman. And nowhere in the Bible does God or anybody else condemn this practice or say that it like goes against God. Sounds to me like there's things outside of the gender binary in the Bible. So the fact that you're cherry picking Genesis 1:27 while ignoring all of the passages that speak favorably of people who are gender non-conforming, aka eunuchs, it's a little suspicious. All right, so that's 2 contextual problems, 3 textual problems, and here's 2 metatextual problems. This commenter and Fulnecki are making the claim that it is a Christian belief that there are only 2 genders. So why is it that I can find Christians that disagree? Why is it that I can find affirming churches? Why is it that I can find queer churches? Why is it that I can find trans people who consider themselves Christian? The fact that there are denominations and theologians that disagree with you is proof that this is not an absolute tenet of Christian faith. This is just an opinion you happen to have. Another metatextual problem I'm having is intertemporal. Can you find me a Christian 1,000 years ago, 500 years ago that wrote down the words exactly, there are only 2 genders, or there are only 2 genders and you cannot move in between them? Find me a Saint so-and-so of somewheresville who wrote down the words, I respecteth not thine pronouns. Because if you can't, then you cannot say that this is just a belief that has always been part of Christianity. It's a new belief. And maybe you think that new belief is valid, and maybe you think the belief would have never come up until now, and that's fine, but you need to make the argument that the belief is still coherent with the overarching Christian worldview. You can't just say that it's a fact because it feels like a fact to you and have it be a fact to me. Okay, why am I rattling off all of these arguments? My goal here is I want to demonstrate to you, I want to show very clearly what I mean when I say this is my cognitive experience of language. I am reading, I am hearing, I am speaking words as a way of trying to understand the objective reality that is around me. And when I do that, it becomes very clear to me that this claim that there are only 2 genders because Bible is a very weak claim. But this commenter is not experiencing language the same way that I am. For them, they just have to assert the claim is true and then perform their confidence in it. And then that is enough in their psychology to make it feel true. His language is just performance. It's not reality seeking, it's reality making. He's trying to convince himself that the Bible is very clear on this issue because he doesn't want to wrestle with his own transphobia. He just wants to blame his bad behavior on God. But me, language doesn't work like that.